Recently, the pickup artist Redhawk published an article on the dissident right's attitude towards sex. In it, he argued that the conservative and religious right's emphasis upon chastity before marriage is preventing the movement from regaining control of our society. Appealing to the ways in which men and women navigate sex and hierarchy, he suggested that the right needs to recognise the natural inequalities of sex. Men with many sexual partners are attractive to women, while the contrary is the case for women, and that they should embrace them. In so doing, a new generation of masculine, alpha men will be raised up ready to take positions of authority within our society and turn it away from the harmful effects of feminism. As one might expect, Redhawk's article sparked controversy, with the cast of Women's Hour dissecting and critiquing his views. In turn, the academic agent invited Redhawk to respond via a live-stream dialogue. Near the beginning of the video, academic agent accuses many of Redhawk's critics of committing the is-ought fallacy. In the late 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume observed that sound argumentation must distinguish between two categories: that which is the case, the observable facts about the world, and that which ought to be the case, the ideal. It is important to keep the two separate. How the world is cannot tell you how it ought to be, and how the world should be cannot tell you what it is really like. AA suggested that opponents of Redhawk's article were denying reality. Redhawk was describing the social and sexual dynamics between men and women, while his critics are arguing that these dynamics ought not to be the case. They need to deal with what are the ways in which men and women navigate sex and hierarchies, instead of what they ought to be. However, in my view, this is a serious case of projection. Redhawk's argument consists in two steps. First, an attempt to outline the natural and traditional relationships men and women have with sex. These are is-claims, statements about the facts of the world. Second, that we should follow those patterns of behaviour because they are natural and will help us regain our society. These are ought claims. This can be seen in the shift in language in Redhawk's arguments, and I'll give a couple of quotations here. I would absolutely encourage a system in which men go out into the world, make something of themselves, and also learn women's nature, and how to establish a strong frame into which a woman would fall. Or again, I would also unironically have right-wing men, under the friend-enemy distinction, take war brides from the weak men of the left. And finally, what we need now is a new generation of men to break their gynocentric programming and to take back what is ours. These are not claims about how the world is. Rather, they detail what Redhawk thinks the world ought to be, or at least what the dissident right ought to do. Unfortunately, Redhawk and AA use the is-ought distinction as a Mott and Bailey. Whenever the Bailey of Redhawk's moral and practical prescriptions come under fire, they retreat to the Mott, saying that they are only examining reality in a value-free manner. In so doing, Redhawk's suggestions never have to be defended on their own terms. It is just assumed that natural sexual relations are morally and politically good. Of course, this begs the question: are the sexual and social hierarchies, as Redhawk describes them, good? Redhawk assumes that the natural order is inherently good. Laws have repressed authentic masculinity, while the conservative religious rights views hinder its expression. The chains of social structure and ideology need to be broken for men and women to return to their natural, traditional roles, men as authoritative, women as submissive, and in turn, this will heal society. Such a vision is, barring its emphasis upon sex, Rousseauian. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed human nature is inherently good, and that suffering is caused by unjust social structures. This is a view inherited by the modern left, which seeks to rescue humanity through liberation from oppressive regimes. By contrast, the conservative vision sees human nature as inherently flawed. It is always prone, when chance arises, to committing evil if it is deemed advantageous. Thus, social practices and institutions develop in order to restrain the human propensity for wrongdoing. This is particularly the case for people in power. Checks and balances put in place to mitigate their inevitable misdeeds. Marriage can be seen as one social institution which has, traditionally, had the function of preventing men from fathering many children, without taking responsibility for them and their mother's well-being. For his part, academic agent recognizes that human nature may not be inherently good, pushing back on some of Redhawk's suggestions, which would allow men to be in positions where they would have the opportunity to treat women wickedly. However, Redhawk's argument is also pragmatic. He suggests that a return to natural and traditional forms of masculinity and femininity will enable the dissident right to reclaim positions of authority in society. In his view, highly successful men, alpha males, have typically been sexually successful. Consequently, if we are to produce alphas and incentivize such men to join our movement, we must encourage premarital sexual promiscuity, which will supply them with a certain confidence and reputation needed to crush the ruling regime. A significant flaw in Redhawk's view is that he bases his conception of the alpha male on successful men who have and are currently ruling. Though for some, simply having guys on our side in charge is enough, for most, we don't want to simply replace Harvey Weinstein, Bill Clinton, and Boris Johnson with our Harvey, Bill, and Boris. We want something more akin to Thomas Carlyle's great man, leaders who will remake society in accordance with the transcendent laws of nature. In that case, the question can be restated as follows. Does promiscuity before marriage help men become Carlylean great men? An answer can be found by ruminating on the nature of love. To love someone is much more than a feeling. It is to empty oneself for another, giving your life up for theirs, making them your thoughts, desires, and actions. Such an attitude so pours out the self that it is willing to die for the beloved. For a man, his love might be manifested in putting his wife, children, family, and friends before his own interests. Tying ourselves up in another so absolutely can lead us towards the divine, as Dante found in his love for Beatrice, or Beron in his love for Luthien. In giving ourselves to another, we see more clearly the transcendent, which continually gives itself to us. In turn, the emptying of the self for a beloved imitates the way we should relate to the transcendent. The great man absolutely gives up his life, to the point of death, in adherence to the laws of the universe. He is so sincere that he pours out his own interests in favour of the higher principle. Romantic love, thus, trains us in the way of the great man of Carlyle. It teaches us what it means, on a manageable level, to give yourself to another, indeed something of greater value than ourselves. By contrast, premarital promiscuity engenders the exact opposite attitude. It educates young men and women to place their own desires and pleasures above others, viewing women as objects of possession to be used rather than loved. It closes off, rather than opens up, the self-giving and sacrificing character required of great men in relation to the transcendent. Beyond questions of sexual ethics, I think Redhawk's article and dialogue with AA raise a broader issue. Though Redhawk effusively informs the reader that he respects religious people on the dissident right, by which he particularly means Christians, the rest of the article sees such people as a problem. He tells us that we are going to have to break some eggs to make this omelette, despite the screams of the religious right. He sees the Christian idea that God is number one as simply not cutting it for most men, and as their morals prevent men from becoming alphas, Christians should get out of the way. His thought chimes with modern right-wing pagans, who spend their time attacking Christianity as the foundation for the left's ethical and political positions. AA has also questioned whether various aspects of Christian teaching hinder the progress of the dissident right. Such skepticism lies, to my mind, in the different worldviews. For Redhawk, the number one reason men are on Earth is to have sex. He says as much in his article. For AA, it's difficult to determine, but we may say there is no purpose in life beyond gaining power. Though such views clash with the pagans, they can agree on the events which constitute history, and that the natural, whether that's transcendent or purely material, is the basis for morality. By contrast, the Christian believes that history changed with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God. These events are the beginning of a new creation, setting in process the remaking of the world. The cross and resurrection of Jesus enable Christians to live for God, adhering to the teachings of Christ and empowered to do so through the transcendent power of the Holy Spirit. Thus, Christians disagree with atheists, agnostics, and pagans on what has happened in history, and as such how we are to live, and by what power we are to do so. The divide consists in two different visions of reality. For a Christian, there are those who belong to the old order, and those that belong to the new. Consequently, I propose that Christians on the dissident or alternative right should see themselves as a distinct political group. We should build networks and relationships which are explicitly and exclusively for Christians. In so doing, we will be able to develop into a tightly organized and self-interested minority which has a common set of purposes and values. Such a group will be more effective in creating a unified movement capable of ruling the majority than a broad coalition. Moreover, we are more likely to succeed as a formal grouping than with folks who blame us for society's ills. This would not preclude continued engagement with and learning from others in the dissident right, but rather would constitute a formalization and organization of a minority with common goals. Everyone in these spheres may well be happier and more successful for it. Thank you for listening.